In the summer of 1899, a 40-year-old engineer stood in the yard behind his rented house in Detroit, staring at a strange, sputtering machine made of bicycle wheels, leather belts, and a single-cylinder engine. His neighbors thought he was insane. His wife had learned to ignore the smell of gasoline that clung to his clothes every night. He had already failed once, completely, publicly, humiliatingly. And in a few years, he would fail again. But this man would go on to reshape not just an industry, but the entire rhythm of modern life. How people worked, how they traveled, how they thought about time itself. His name was Henry Ford. And this is the story of how a farm boy who hated farming became the man who put the world on wheels. Act 1. The Boy Who Took Apart Watches. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on a modest family farm in Dearborn, Michigan, in the middle of the American Civil War. His parents, William and Mary Ford, were hard-working, God-fearing farmers of Irish and Belgian descent, and to them, the future was simple. Their eldest son would inherit the land, work the soil, and carry on the family trade, just as sons had done for generations before him. But young Henry had other ideas. From the time he could walk, he showed almost no interest in crops or livestock. What captivated him instead were machines, anything with gears, springs, or moving parts. By the age of 13, he had taken apart nearly every watch and clock he could get his hands on, then painstakingly put them back together, teaching himself the mechanics of timekeeping through pure trial and error. Neighbors began bringing him their broken pocket watches to fix, and the local farm boy quietly became the town's unofficial watch repairman, working late into the night by candlelight, driven by nothing but curiosity. Then, at age 12, something happened that would set the entire course of his life. Henry saw a self-propelled steam engine on the road, a large, road-going traction engine used to power farm equipment. It wasn't a car. It wasn't even close. But it moved under its own power, without a horse pulling it, and for young Henry, that image burned itself into his mind. He would later say that seeing that steam engine on the road was the moment he decided he would spend his life building a horseless carriage. Life on the farm, however, was not gentle to the Ford family. In 1876, when Henry was just 13 years old, his mother Mary died during childbirth. It was a devastating blow. Henry adored his mother, and later in life he would say that losing her felt like losing the anchor of the entire household. His father, grieving and overwhelmed, expected Henry to step into a more serious role on the farm. But the farm work Henry did every day only deepened his conviction that this was not the life meant for him. He hated the drudgery of it, the same tasks, the same seasons, the same unpredictability of weather and soil. He wanted control. He wanted precision. He wanted machines. At 16, against his father's wishes, Henry Ford left the family farm and walked to Detroit to become an apprentice machinist. It was a bold and somewhat reckless decision for a boy his age in the 1870s, leaving behind land, security, and family expectation for the uncertain world of industrial apprenticeship. He took a job at the Michigan Car Company and later worked for James Flower and Brothers Machine Shop, and eventually the Detroit Dry Dock Company, learning everything he could about steam engines, mechanical systems, and industrial machinery. He was paid poorly, sometimes barely enough to survive, and to make ends meet, he took a second job at night repairing watches at a jewelry shop, sleeping only a few hours before starting his apprenticeship work again the next morning. By his early 20s, Henry had become a skilled mechanic, but the farm still called him back, quite literally. His father offered him 40 acres of forested land if he would return home, and Henry accepted, not to farm it, but to use the timber to build a home and support himself while he continued experimenting with machines on the side. It was during this period, in 1888, that he married Clara Bryant, a farmer's daughter he had met at a New Year's Eve dance years earlier. Clara would become the one constant, steady presence throughout the chaos of Henry's coming career, patient, practical, and quietly supportive, even when his ambitions bordered on obsession. In 1891, Henry made the decision that would change everything. He took a job as an engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit, the local electric utility. It was steady, respectable work, and it paid well. But more importantly, it gave him access to something he desperately needed: knowledge of internal combustion engines, which were still an emerging and poorly understood technology at the time. Working night shifts allowed him free time during the day to experiment. In the small brick shed behind his rented home on Bagley Avenue, Henry began building his first gasoline-powered vehicle. Act 2. The Quadricycle and the First Failures. By 1896, after years of tinkering, testing, and rebuilding, Henry Ford completed his first working automobile, a lightweight vehicle he called the Quadricycle. It looked almost comically simple by modern standards, essentially a metal frame mounted on 4 bicycle wheels, powered by a small 2-cylinder gasoline engine, with a tiller instead of a steering wheel and no reverse gear. It had no brakes to speak of in the way we'd recognize today, and it made a deafening racket. But it ran. In the early hours of June 4, 1896, Ford prepared to take the Quadricycle out for its first test drive through the streets of Detroit. There was just one problem. The machine was too wide to fit through the door of the shed he had built it in. In a moment that perfectly captured his engineering mindset, solve the problem directly, worry about the consequences later, Ford grabbed an axe and knocked down part of the brick wall of the shed to get his invention out onto the street. His wife Clara, understandably, must have wondered exactly what she had married into. That night, with a friend riding a bicycle ahead of him to warn pedestrians and horses of the strange, loud machine approaching, Henry Ford drove his Quadricycle through the streets of Detroit. It worked. He had built a horseless carriage, just as he'd promised himself he would as a boy, watching that steam engine on the road years earlier. Word of Ford's success reached Thomas Edison himself at a company gathering. When Ford described what he had built to the great inventor, Edison reportedly banged his fist on the table and told him, "Young man, that's the thing. You have it. Your car is self-contained and carries its own power plant." It was a rare moment of encouragement from one of the most famous inventors in the world, and it lit a fire under Ford that never went out. Encouraged, Ford quit his stable job at Edison Illuminating in 1899 to pursue automobile manufacturing full-time. He helped found the Detroit Automobile Company that same year, backed by a group of Detroit investors eager to cash in on the emerging automobile craze. It should have been his big break. It was, instead, his first public failure. Ford, ever the perfectionist engineer, kept redesigning and refining his vehicles rather than pushing them into steady production. The investors grew impatient. The cars that did make it to market were considered too expensive and not reliable enough. Within about 18 months, the Detroit Automobile Company folded, and Ford walked away. Some accounts say he was pushed out, having produced barely any cars at all. To the Detroit business community, Henry Ford was now a 40-year-old man with a failed company and a reputation as a stubborn tinkerer who couldn't turn his ideas into a functioning business. Most men would have given up. Ford did something almost stranger instead. He decided to prove himself through racing. Act 3. Racing for credibility. Understanding that public perception was now his biggest obstacle, Ford turned to auto racing as a way to demonstrate that his engineering was sound and his vehicles were fast, reliable, and worthy of investment. In 1901, he built a race car and personally challenged Alexander Winton, one of the most famous and successful automobile racers and manufacturers in America at the time, to a race at the Grosse Pointe track in Michigan. Almost nobody expected Ford to win. Winton was the established champion. Ford was a failed businessman with something to prove. But in front of a crowd of several thousand spectators, Ford's car outlasted Winton's after Winton's engine began overheating and faltering. Ford won the race. It was exactly the kind of victory he needed. The win generated enormous publicity and, crucially, attracted new investors willing to back him for a second attempt at building an automobile company. Later, in 1902, Ford designed and built an even faster race car, a fearsome vehicle nicknamed the 999, equipped with a massive engine and driven by daredevil bicycle racer Barney Oldfield, who had never even driven a car before, but learned in a matter of days. The 999 shattered speed records and cemented Ford's name in the public imagination as a serious engineer, not just a dreamer. Riding this momentum, Ford co-founded a second company, the Henry Ford Company, in late 1901. But history nearly repeated itself. Disagreements over direction with his business partners led to Ford leaving this company as well within months, a company that would later be reorganized without him into what eventually became Cadillac. Twice now, Ford had started an automobile company, and twice he had walked away, or been walked out, without lasting success. But this time, he had something he didn't have before: proof that his engineering worked, credibility from his racing victories, and a small circle of investors still willing to bet on him, chief among them a coal dealer named Alexander Malcolmson. Act 4. The birth of Ford Motor Company. In June 1903, Henry Ford, Alexander Malcolmson, and a group of investors founded the Ford Motor Company with just $28,000 in cash capital, a relatively modest sum even by the standards of the time. Ford held a stake in the company and, crucially, this time retained far more creative and engineering control than he had in his previous ventures. The company's first vehicle, the Model A, sold reasonably well and gave the fledgling company its first taste of stability. Over the next several years, Ford Motor Company released a series of vehicles labeled with letters of the alphabet, models B, C, F, K, N, R, and S, each one an experiment, each one teaching Ford and his engineering team more about what worked, what didn't, and most importantly, what ordinary Americans actually wanted and could afford. Because that was the obsession forming in Henry Ford's mind. The automobile, at the turn of the century, was a luxury toy for the wealthy. Cars were handmade, expensive, and unreliable, and owning one was a status symbol reserved for the elite. Ford believed something radically different. He believed the automobile could and should be a tool for the common person. A farmer, a shopkeeper, a factory worker. Someone like the young man he had once been, growing up on that Dearborn farm, dreaming of a machine that could move without a horse. In 1908, that vision became reality with the launch of the Model T. Act 5. The Model T and the moving assembly line. The Model T was not the flashiest car of its era, nor the fastest, nor the most luxurious. But it was rugged, relatively simple to repair, and, critically, designed from the outset to be produced efficiently and sold at a price that middle-class and even working-class Americans could realistically afford. At its introduction, the Model T cost around $825, still a significant sum, but far below the price of comparable vehicles at the time. Demand exploded. But Ford quickly realized that traditional manufacturing methods, where skilled workers built each car largely by hand, moving between stationary workstations, simply could not produce Model Ts fast enough or cheaply enough to meet the demand he was creating. So in 1913, at his Highland Park plant in Michigan, Ford and his engineering team introduced the innovation that would define his legacy as much as the car itself, the moving assembly line. Inspired partly by the disassembly lines used in Chicago meatpacking plants, where carcasses moved along a line while workers performed a single specialized task at each station, Ford's team flipped the concept in reverse. Instead of workers moving to the car, or rather, the chassis, would move past stationary workers on a conveyor system, with each worker performing one specific, repeated task as it passed by. The results were staggering. Before the moving assembly line, it took roughly 12.5 hours to assemble a single Model T chassis. After implementing the moving line, that time collapsed to around 90 minutes. Production numbers soared into the hundreds of thousands, then eventually into the millions, and the price of the Model T, rather than rising as demand increased, as might be expected, actually fell year after year, eventually dropping to under $300 by the 1920s, a price so low that Ford's own factory workers could afford to buy the very car they were building. This is where Henry Ford made what may have been his single boldest and most consequential business decision. In January 1914, he announced that Ford Motor Company would pay its workers $5 a day, more than double the prevailing wage for factory work at the time, while simultaneously reducing the workday from 9 hours to 8. The business world was stunned, and many called it reckless, even dangerous to the broader economy. But Ford's reasoning was sharper than critics gave him credit for. He understood that a workforce paid well enough to afford the products they were building would create a self-sustaining cycle of production and consumption. Workers who could now afford cars, appliances, and consumer goods, fueling demand throughout the entire economy. It also dramatically reduced worker turnover, which had been a massive hidden cost of the grueling, repetitive assembly line work. Word of the $5 day spread across the country, and thousands of job seekers lined up outside Ford's factories, hoping for a position. Ford had not only revolutionized how cars were built, he had begun to reshape the very structure of the American middle class. By the mid-1920s, the Ford Motor Company was producing more than half of all automobiles sold in the entire United States. The Model T alone would go on to sell over 15 million units before production ended in 1927, a record that would stand for decades. Henry Ford, the farm boy who had knocked down a wall to drive his first invention out onto the street, was now one of the wealthiest and most famous men on the planet. Act 6. The Harder Truths. No honest telling of Henry Ford's story can stop at the assembly line and the $5 day, because Ford's life was also marked by real and serious flaws that are important to understand alongside his achievements. As Ford grew older and more powerful, he became increasingly resistant to change, even change that his own company desperately needed. He was famously reluctant to update the Model T's design for years after competitors like General Motors began offering more stylish, comfortable, and varied vehicles. Ford reportedly once said, "Customers could have the Model T in any color they want, so long as it's black," a statement that captured both his commitment to manufacturing efficiency and his stubborn resistance to evolving consumer tastes. By the mid-1920s, this rigidity nearly cost Ford Motor Company its dominant position, and the company was forced into a costly, painful retooling to launch the Model A as a replacement in 1927, shutting down production for months and laying off tens of thousands of workers in the process. Far more seriously, Henry Ford held and actively promoted deeply troubling anti-Semitic views later in his life. Beginning in the early 1920s, he used his own newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, to publish a series of anti-Semitic articles and conspiracy theories, which were later compiled and distributed as a book. This material caused real harm, contributed to the spread of anti-Semitic ideas in the United States and internationally, and was later cited approvingly by Nazi leadership in Germany, including Adolf Hitler, who kept a portrait of Ford in his office and referenced him in his own writings. Ford eventually issued a public apology in 1927 under significant pressure, retracting the statements and shutting down the publication of that material, though the damage done to individuals and communities, and the historical stain on his legacy, cannot be undone by an apology alone. This part of Ford's history remains a serious and necessary part of understanding who he was, a reminder that industrial genius and moral failure can exist within the very same person. Ford was also a fiercely controlling employer, and later in his career, an aggressive opponent of labor unions, even as the very wage increases he had once pioneered became standard demands of the labor movement he resisted. His company's private security force clashed violently with union organizers in the 1930s, most infamously during the confrontation known as the Battle of the Overpass in 1937, in which Ford security personnel beat United Auto Workers organizers, including Walter Reuther, in an incident that was photographed and became a public relations disaster for the company. Act 7. Later Years and Legacy. Despite these controversies, Ford Motor Company continued to grow throughout the 1930s and into World War II, when Ford's factories, including the massive Willow Run plant, pivoted to producing bombers and military vehicles at extraordinary volume for the American war effort, applying the same mass production principles that had built the Model T empire. Henry Ford's personal life in his later years was marked by tragedy as well. His only son, Edsel Ford, who had taken over as president of the company, struggled for years under his father's continued interference and controlling management style, even after officially holding the top position. Edsel died in 1943 at just 49 years old, reportedly worn down by stress and illness, a loss that devastated Henry. Grief-stricken and increasingly frail, the elderly Henry Ford briefly resumed control of the company himself before it ultimately passed to his grandson, Henry Ford II. Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, at the age of 83, at his estate in Dearborn, not far from the farm where he had been born 83 years earlier. He died one of the richest men in American history, having built a company that still bears his family name today, more than a century after its founding. Closing reflection. Henry Ford's life resists a simple, tidy narrative. He was not a man who succeeded once and coasted on that success. He failed twice, publicly and humiliatingly, before finally building something that endured. He was not purely a visionary humanitarian, as some tellings suggest, nor was he simply a ruthless industrialist, as others claim. He was both a man who genuinely believed that ordinary working people deserved dignity, fair wages, and access to the products of modern industry, and a man capable of causing real harm through his own prejudices and his resistance to change. What remains undeniable is the scale of his impact. Before Henry Ford, the automobile was a plaything of the wealthy. After Henry Ford, it was a fixture of ordinary life, reshaping where people could live, how far they could work from home, how goods moved across a continent, and how an entire century would come to measure progress itself. The moving assembly line he perfected didn't just build cars faster, it became the blueprint for modern manufacturing across nearly every industry on Earth. It all started with a boy on a Michigan farm who preferred taking apart watches to plowing fields, who saw a steam engine on a country road and decided, right then, that he would spend his life building a machine that could move on its own. He knocked down a wall to prove it could be done. And in doing so, he helped build the road the entire 20th century would drive on.